Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk briefly about the concept of sustainability. Now, sustainability is defined as the human use of resources without depleting the resources so that way future generations can also use these resources. So really, this is just wise use of the stuff that we have available to us. Now, there are 5 indicators that are used to determine the overall sustainability of the human population. The first indicator is biological diversity, or how much stuff is living on the earth. Now, the problem is, if we think about biological diversity today, there are quite a few extinctions that are happening every single year. And it's predicted that these extinctions are going to continue for the foreseeable future, especially if we continue living the way that we are today. The second piece of determining sustainability is our overall food production. And this is determined by the per capita or per person production of food. Now, it's predicted that our per capita production is probably going to be leveling off here pretty quickly. And we're not entirely sure what that means for the future. So we don't know if our per capita food production is going to keep up with the constantly growing human population unless that human population starts to slow down or level off in terms of size. The third piece is the average global surface temperature and carbon dioxide concentration. Now, this is a measure that we can see the trend of over the past several years looking at the Mauna Loa Observatory. We can see that since observations started being measured back in the 1960s, this concentration has constantly been increasing every single year. And it's predicted that this is going to continue increasing, especially if we are not going to do anything to curb or reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. Now, there's hope. If we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, hopefully our global surface temperature is going to come back down to a more normal measure. So that's the graph on the bottom left of your screen. You can see compared to this average, we can see that on average our temperature has been increasing. Yes, it fluctuates a little every year, but on average it's been increasing. And this increase goes hand in hand with the increase in carbon dioxide concentration. The fourth indicator would be our overall human population. Now, we know from our populations unit that the human population is still increasing. However, the hope comes because the growth rate is actually starting to decrease, which means that instead of growing exponentially, our population will start to level off just a little bit. And that's good news because our Earth needs to be able to support all of these humans that are living on it. And the fifth indicator for sustainability would be resource depletion. And this is the thing that most people think about when you think of sustainability. Now, if we look at the human population and the Earth as a whole, we have been using our resources much, much faster than they can be replaced. Now, the hope is that human ingenuity and human inventions are going to create new resources. Or we're going to be able to use the existing resources more efficiently, which is great and it's hopeful, but I'm not sure if that should be what we're relying on. Perhaps we should shift to start thinking about how can we use less resources overall so we're not just shifting from depleting one resource to depleting another resource. So if we look around the world, we can see the most serious environmental problems are different depending on where you are. In the United States, right now, our main concern is the depletion of natural resources. And that's the same for much of Europe. If we look at places like Russia, we're also dealing with air pollution, and in China, they're dealing with automobile emission issues. And that's because we're adding too much pollutants to the atmosphere, and in China those are mostly coming from cars, whereas in Russia it's mostly coming from industry. But if we look into Central and South America, we see that little tiger indicator. And that's because that particular part of the world, due to rapidly expanding and encroaching human populations, they're starting to see a significant loss in biodiversity. So throughout the world, we're dealing with all of these issues. However, some areas, certain issues are more prevalent than others. This leads into this idea of maximum sustainable yield. So how can we use our resources responsibly so that way we don't run out? So the definition of maximum sustainable yield is the maximum amount of a resource that can be harvested without causing damage to the future availability of that resource. So this is when you're looking at that population growth diagram, you want to be at that maximum growth rate. So when the graph is at the steepest angle, that's where you want to keep the population to stay at maximum sustainable yield. So if we look at this diagram, we have our growth rate in one of the lines, and then we have our total biomass in the dashed line. So we want to have our population staying at a pretty constant rate. So that means for every individual we harvest, there's another individual that repopulates. So in the left-hand side of that graph where it's green, our fish are dying of old age. So we could potentially be catching more fish without really depleting the overall stock. So that goal is to catch them before they reach old age, but not so fast that we are catching them before they reproduce. So we want to be in that yellow range where we're catching them right at that sweet spot. Now, if our harvest is larger than the amount of new offspring, now we've moved into the danger zone in the red section. So what's happening is the fish are being caught before they can reproduce. So we are catching them early on in that growth diagram. Now there are some problems with the idea of maximum sustainable yield, because we don't always know the life history or the survivorship strategy of the species. Now with maximum sustainable yield, it's also really difficult to determine the birth rate and death rate of a population, especially if it's a wild population. We don't always know everywhere that each individual is born and are not always able to account for each individual that dies. So it's really difficult to determine the true carrying capacity of that system. Now, maximum sustainable yields can become political when people are trying to argue why we should raise or lower the number of individuals of the species that are available to be harvested. Now, some individuals, particularly if we're using our fishing example, the fishermen probably want to be able to catch some more fish so they can have more of a profit. But the environmentalists might want to stop that because they want to keep that fishery healthy. Now, most fishermen also want to keep that fishery healthy. They want to be able to have a long-term career, and they want the longevity of that system. But this can lead to a lot of fighting between groups that either want more individuals harvested or want to protect a number that are being out in the wild. So knowing all this information, while it's all great, we're never truly able to know everything to make a proper estimation. So people are always going to want to try to either fight for more harvest or less harvest. So in summary, you need to know the 5 indicators associated with sustainability, which are biological diversity, food production, average global surface temperature, and concentration of carbon dioxide. Also, another indicator is human population size and resource depletion. Additionally, you will need to know a little bit about what maximum sustainable yield is and how it's used to determine sustainability. Please send me your questions here at the end, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.